Mr. Volker Perthes, the Secretary General, Special Representative and the head of the United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, known as UNITAMS. Welcome to Al-Arabiya, sir.
Thank you, Talal. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
You met with the Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdouk on February the 14th, but when you left the meeting, did you have the feeling that Sudan has great challenges, but that the government is on the right track to recovery with the help, of course, from the United Nations and from the Friends of Sudan?
I do think that the new government, the political government, which was formed under the leadership of Prime Minister Hamdouk, is on the right track. And in their very first days, they have proven that they can take some difficult decisions and actually implement them, like the so-called floating of the exchange rate of the Sudanese pound. That wasn't easy, but they did it, and so far, so good. It seems to work rather well. We hope that they will maintain that course. The challenges, no doubt, are big, and it's political challenges, no doubt. It's economic challenges. It's challenges to complete the peace process, and in addition to that, the Sudanese had to cope with the crisis on their border with Ethiopia, something they really didn't need, and as you know, with some natural disasters like floods and locusts. So the challenges are many. I do think that the international community realizes and appreciates the challenges, but we still need everybody to get his and her act together and actually get the right form of support for the right policies.
Of course, the economic challenges they are facing in Sudan are huge. It's a country with $60 to $70 billion in debt, and its annual inflation soared above 300% last month. On the 16th of February, Sudan declared a state of emergency after the protest over soaring food prices. Last Sunday, the 21st of February, Sudan announced to manage a floating exchange rate system of its currency and sharply devaluated that currency. How soon do you think the effects will be felt on the ground, and will this convince the donors from the Berlin conference in June of 2020 who put conditions on Sudan? How convinced are they in the Paris conference next May to fulfill their commitments made in Berlin, because Sudan now has done what it's been asked to do?
Well, the donors in their discussions with the Sudanese authorities have long insisted that the floating or liberalizing or unifying of the exchange rate would be a major step in order to unlock economic support for Sudan. So the other day, the Minister of Finance, together with the World Bank, have actually started the so-called Family Support Program, which is an internationally supported program to hand out checks, actually, to Sudanese families. It's still a pilot program. There's a lot of work to be done, but it is important, of course, that those who are most vulnerable in Sudan do get direct aid. I still cannot say what the immediate effects of the exchange rate reform will be. That will probably need a couple of days to materialize. But let us be honest, the majority of people in Sudan who have dealt with foreign currency have been dealing with the so-called black market or parallel market in the first place. So there is a real chance now that people start using the official channels, and we see some signs that this is happening. So expect that Sudanese expatriates will now use official bank channels to bring their money home to their relatives. And of course, a big door has been opened for investments into Sudan. Now, the next step, I think, is for Sudan and its partners to make clear that Sudan is not a humanitarian basket case, but rather a up-and-coming investment case. And I think Sudan will make quite some effort with its business people, with the government, to present such an image of Sudan at the Paris conference, which you were talking about, Talal.
I would like to move to the FEMIN, Early Warning System Network. There was a warning from this network that food insecurity could reach a crisis level in parts of Sudan like Kordofan and Darfur in the coming months after the price of bread and sugar has soared way above the ordinary man's means. What can you tell us about these warning of food insecurity and rising prices?
We do indeed have a problem with malnutrition and food insecurity in vast parts of the country. Inflation is an issue. It is at different levels in different parts of the country. What we certainly need is a stabilization of the economic situation, and therefore the family support program supported by the World Bank and by donors is so relevant, is so important at this moment. The next very important step also is that Sudan, with the economic measures that it took, is on the way towards debt relief. And of course, debt relief will allow Sudan to get into new relationships with the World Bank and with the IMF and with other donors to relieve the socio-economic situation, which indeed, as you said, is grave in some parts of the region. There is a risk to human security, because people are having to spend a lot of money, more than they have, for essential foodstuffs in some parts of the region. There's a lot of relief by the World Food Program. They are doing a great job here. But the important thing, of course, that Sudan is coming on its own feet, can feed its own population, and they will only do that if the economy recovers. And therefore, we are looking towards an integrated approach of the United Nations, the donor countries, the World Bank, the IFIs, including the IMF, that is, and of course the Sudanese government itself, in order to bring the economy back up onto its feet here in Sudan.
The U.S. decision to remove Sudan from the list of sponsors of terrorism last October allowed Sudan to access foreign aid, investment, and debt relief, as well as military aid. How does UNITAMS intend to use this new status after years of isolations on Sudan?
Yeah, actually, you're right. It's a very, very important point, and it's something which the previous U.S. administration did right among the many things they didn't do right. So we are grateful for that, and the Sudanese are grateful for that. What is important here, and you said it, is that with the lifting of sanctions, with the lifting of being on the American list of terror supporting states, Sudan is back into the world, or can re-establish relationships that it didn't have before. It is possible now for investors to come, and as you're speaking of UNITAMS and the UN family here, it is possible for us to design a program with the UN family, and together, of course, with the Sudanese authorities, which is not only geared towards humanitarian aid, but which is geared towards development. So it's a totally different situation also for the UN family than what we had in the 30 past years. In these 30 years, Sudan was internationally isolated. It was a humanitarian case. The UN World Food Program and AL-HAJ and other agencies did their work, but there wasn't like a common internationally backed strategy towards economic and social development. That is something we are starting with now, with great support from different donor countries that want to work together with the United Nations and with the government of Sudan. There is a so-called Friends of Sudan group that is coordinating with the UN and with the Sudanese government. So I guess we're going to see some early fruits hanging rather low, probably already at the Paris conference, which you mentioned.
The return of refugees and IDPs, internally displaced people, is also a big problem in Sudan. How is UNITAMS working to achieve these goals? With the help, I'm sure, of the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, how do you see this progressing?
As you rightly say, Talal, on the question of refugees and IDPs, internally displaced person, the lead agency here is the UNHCR. And so we don't have, as UNITAMS, which is a rather small mission with a great mandate, as UNITAMS, we don't have to duplicate what UNHCR does. But what we can do together with UNHCR and IOM and other agencies is so to develop a common program where the support for refugees and for internally displaced persons would be part of a broader development program. Now, of course, no one wants to have IDPs in IDP camps forever and the international community to support them. What we want is, and what the Sudanese want, is that these people have a chance either to go back to where they come from, to the property, to the lands which they have tilled in the past. Now, in some cases, the land is no longer arable or other people are using it, so there have to be negotiations. Therefore, the Sudanese in their Juba Peace Agreement have agreed on the Land Commission. The United Nations will be part of this Land Commission and will support it. So that is a huge and a long-term program. But the important thing is we have a political will here on the side of the Sudanese government to deal with the IDPs and the IDP camps as citizens, not as enemies anymore. We have a peace agreement between the different factions that have been fighting one another in Darfur and some other areas. And on that basis, actually development and working with the IDPs and working with the Land Commission can start. That wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
In Darfur, there were incidents of tribal infighting that led to the death of about 250 people and the displacement of thousands of Sudanese in January. Is the government taking the right steps to deal with the latest trouble in Darfur, and what is your advice to them? This leads me also to another question. Did UNAMID, the peacekeeping operation, leave Sudan too early?
If UNAMID had still been there at that stage, they wouldn't have been able to prevent these terrible events which you were speaking about. They weren't in Jenaina. They were in Jabal Mara, but they were not in Jenaina, and that's quite a distance between the two places. So even if the mandate for UNAMID had been prolonged for a couple of months, that wouldn't have changed the course of things. Since it has been decided by the Security Council on the basis of the wishes of the Sudanese government that UNAMID is going to go, I think it is important that the Sudanese government actually takes ownership over the challenges they are facing and the populations and the different tribes and the different strata of the population are facing in Darfur. Now, you may ask, and actually ask me, did the government do the right thing? And you could always say they did too little and they did too late, but they started taking responsibility here. They sent a high-level delegation to Jenaina and the surroundings. They did manage to have a negotiated agreement between the tribes. You may argue it came too late because people were already dead. That's true, but we also have to see how limited the capacities of the law enforcement agencies in Darfur are. People have definitely more trust in the Sudanese police than into other security actors. They have expressed that very clearly, and the Sudanese police is building up its capacities, its strength, and here actually, and I come to the last part of your question, here actually is an entrance point for international support, including the support which we as UNITAMS and which the United Nations can give to both the state authorities and the people in the camps and people outside the camps who also have grievances. It's not that the Arab tribes are living happily and enriched. No, they have their own grievances. They have bad schooling or no schooling. They lack access to water. So a lot of things have to be done in terms of development, but also in terms of early warning. When the herders want to have their cattle going to a water source, they often go through areas where peasants are tilling the ground. Sometimes it's really a question about knowing at an early stage where the transhumance, as it is called, where the cattle herds are going to go. We can help with projects that are using geodata. We can help with training the police. We can help with training community groups in doing early warning together. And the good news, sort of in this very, very difficult and challenging environment, is that the Sudanese authorities have told us very, very clearly that they need the support, they want the support, because they see their own people there as their people, as citizens, and that they know that much more has been done to prevent such conflicts from repeating itself.
On February the 9th, the Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok has announced a government reshuffle and appointed 7 ex-rebel chiefs as ministers, like Jibril Ibrahim and Mini Minawi. Do you feel that these ministers will have the confidence and trust of the Sudanese population in general?
Well, you will excuse me for not judging on individual politicians here in Sudan. That's not my job. That's something you journalists can do. But let me put it this way. I mean, all these people who have entered the government as ministers now, they have a constituency. So maybe they are not trusted by everybody, but they do bring a constituency into that super broad coalition government with all these political forces and armed movements which has been established now. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, they have made peace with one another. So you want those groups that make peace with the government and the forces in government that make peace with the armed group. You want them to work together. And of course, working together in a cabinet is quite a challenge for people who were antagonists, who sometimes were fighting one another before. But so far, I think they are all trying their best. Time will tell whether that actually is going to lead to a government where a couple of powerful people and actors actually find a way to use their power in order to bring Sudan forward. We are going to help them if they want it, but in the end, of course, they have to want it.
The all-important 3rd of October Juba peace deal has lots of obstacles to overcome. And some argue that as long as 2 major rebel groups, which are Sudan Liberation Movement and Sudan People's Liberation Movement, and their 2 leaders, Abdul Wahid Noor and Abdul Aziz Al-Hilu, are not signatories to the Juba Agreement, it remains an incomplete peace agreement. Do you have suggestions to the Sudanese government or to the 2 groups to bring them into this peace deal?
Well, the criticism is vindicated. Of course, a peace agreement where 2 groups are missing, 2 groups that do have forces on the ground or do have control over territory, of course it's incomplete, no doubt about that. And I think if you would ask the Prime Minister or if you would ask the President of the Sovereignty Council, they would tell you the same. It's incomplete unless other armed forces who are relevant would also enter it. The Prime Minister has told us, so much I can say out of our conversations, that the second phase of the peace process, which would include Abdulaziz and Abdul Wahid, if he wants to join, that this is a high priority for him. And here's the United Nations, with the expertise which we do have in facilitating negotiations in whatever way. I mean, by helping with the negotiation design, by helping as mediators, by helping in taking minutes. I mean, there are a lot of technical finesses which are needed for that. The United Nations stands ready to support, and we know that there is a demand for that. My team here is in contact with both sides as far as the government and Abdulaziz is concerned. I think there is real will to move forward here. As regards Abdul Wahid, it is not yet clear to me whether he wants to move forward or not. I think he still has to make up his mind.
This important Juba agreement, part of it is for the government to disarm, demobilize, and to reintegrate the rebel forces, which is known in the United Nations language as DDR. Disarm, demobilize, reintegrate. Will UNITAMS help with this process? Usually, the United Nations is always keen to help with the DDR.
Yes, the answer is positive. The United Nations can help here. UNITAMS, the mission, will not necessarily be the implementing agency, but we have a lot of expertise here, for example, in UNDP, in the United Nations Development Programme. And since we are acting as a UN family, the answer is the United Nations stands ready to help with this DDR process, which is always complicated.
Mr. Perthes, what can you tell us about the National Plan for the Protection of Civilians, which was established as per the Juba Agreement, and which has plans also to create joint forces from the government and from some of the rebel forces, around 12,000 soldiers? What can you tell us about this?
The National Plan for the Protection of Civilians, it is a national plan. It is there. The Minister of Interior is in charge, and the United Nations is supporting him in some of the projects he would identify. The joint peacekeeping or peace-building forces or protection of civilian forces, which would include government forces on one hand and rebel forces on the others, has yet to be built. Some of the rebels have brought their forces into the country. Some are on the way of doing that. They have to be registered. I think it will take more time than was originally planned to actually build a common force.
No doubt the Juba peace deal is not going to be cheap to implement. Do you feel that Sudan will be able to pay for the implementation of this deal on its own?
Well, Sudan is definitely hoping that the international community will support it in carrying the costs of this deal. And I think the international community has to understand that without economic support from outside, peace in Sudan will be fragile, will not be sustainable. So it cuts both ways. If the Sudan wants economic support from outside, it has to go forward on its self-chosen path of political reform and peace. But if the international community wants political transition to proceed and the peace to be sustainable, it has to support it economically. It's as simple as that.
How important is accountability in Sudan, and do you think the transitional government in Sudan will hand over the former president Omar al-Bashir to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, as per the 3rd of October Juba peace deal?
That's a very complicated and tricky question for the Sudanese government, not for the SRSG. What I can say is they have last week signed a memorandum of understanding with the ICC, which makes it possible for ICC investigators to work in Sudan on the case of Ali Kushayb, who is already in The Hague, standing trial there. So that was a difficult decision already to have the investigators doing their work. They decided, the government decided, the Sovereignty Council decided that they will let the investigators do their work. So that's an important first step. I cannot judge whether it ever will come to a handover of the former president.
I would like to raise here the Ethiopian-Sudanese border situation, if I may. According to the Sudanese government, the border between the two countries has been delineated in 1902, but not demarked. In November 2020, conflict broke out between the Ethiopian government in northern Tigray region, close to the Sudanese border. What can you tell us about the refugee situation there? And what can you tell us also about the current international mediation efforts?
Well, it's actually three issues that are coming together here. And the one is the conflict in Ethiopia, or between the central authorities in Addis Ababa and the regional government, or what was a regional government in Tigray. This has led, as you rightly said, to the influx of around 60,000 refugees from Ethiopia into Sudan. And here I can say that the Sudanese authorities are living up to their commitments as a member of the United Nations, and they are very supportive to allow the UNHCR to do their work with the refugees, and they are also supporting the refugees as far as they can do that themselves. The second issue is that in the course of that conflict in Ethiopia, also the conflict over the Al-Fashaqqa triangle broke. There is a border which was not disputed in substance before. As you rightly say, the border has been delined in 1902 or 1903, and it had actually been demarcated in the past, not every kilometer, but with signs on the ground. The demographic situation is so that a lot of Ethiopian farmers are actually tilling the lands there in Fashaka. That has been so for a long time. The Sudanese authorities have now taken over the control over most of this triangle, and we are having a bilateral conflict between Ethiopia and Sudan, which needs to be de-escalated. We see a lot of rhetorical escalation, and we have unfortunately seen live fire over the border and soldiers being killed on both sides. And there is a real risk that this escalation, or this would lead to more escalation, particularly in connection with the third issue, which is the GERD Dam, the Renaissance Dam, which has been built by the Ethiopians. There is an issue, as you know, about the filling of the dam, the second phase of the filling of the dam in this summer, and unfortunately the issues are now all being joined, which makes it so much more difficult for mediators to try to solve the issue and de-escalate. The United Nations, of course, they have a regional envoy who does a tour between Ethiopia and Sudan. Secretary General has been on the phone with the Prime Minister in Addis and with the Prime Minister here in Khartoum. The African Union is sending a mediator or facilitator. So there is no lack of mediation, and where the United Nations is needed, the United Nations stands ready, and that is, if I understood it correctly, also the message of the Secretary General to both sides.
With reference to the Renaissance Dam project, there is a serious proposal from the Sudan government for the three parties, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, to hold negotiations under the auspices of the United Nations, the African Union, the European Union, and the United States. Egypt so far has accepted this proposal, but we are yet to hear from Ethiopia. What can you tell us about this proposal, and do you believe that it has a chance to see the light?
You said it all. I mean, you summarized the proposal. I think it's a good proposal, but in order for it to fly, it needs the acceptance of all three parties.
Mr. Perthes, doesn't that lead you to question the reason behind the reluctance of Ethiopia to go forward with such international mediation to solve a very tense situation?
Well, so far, as you rightly say, Ethiopia has been reluctant to accept international mediation in that case. It has at times. We have had negotiations, as you know, about the GERD Dam in Washington. They seem to be successful at some point, but they haven't reached a conclusion. I do think it is actually the task of the international players, mainly those who you mentioned, United Nations, African Union, United States, European Union, and possibly others, to actually try to convince the three main players here, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, to go back to negotiations. And if one player is more reluctant than others, you have to do more convincing here and use the means that are at your disposal to convince that actor to also accept the process.
Mr. Volker Perthes, Special Representative of the Secretary General and the head of UNITAMS in Sudan, we thank you for this interview. We thank you for your time and your insights, and we wish you and UNITAMS all the very best in helping Sudan and the people of Sudan.
Thank you very much, Talal, and thanks for having me on your show.
It's a pleasure, sir. Thank you.